No one wanted to play with the billionaire's 7-year-old paralyzed son until an 8-year-old orphan girl said, "Let's play." What the billionaire did next will break your heart. Before we dive in, this video is crossing time zones right now. What season are you experiencing where you are? If you enjoy this conversation, please like and subscribe to stay connected with us. The winter sun cast long shadows across Oakwood Park's playground. 7-year-old Ethan Matthews sat in his wheelchair, watching other children climb, swing, and slide with the careless abandon he once knew. His small fingers gripped the wheels, but he didn't move. There was nowhere to go that wouldn't remind him of what he couldn't do. His father, Richard Matthews, stood nearby, scrolling through emails on his phone. Occasionally, he would glance up at his son, a flicker of pain crossing his face before returning to the screen. The Matthews name adorned half the buildings in Burlington, Vermont. Richard's technology empire had made him a fortune, but it couldn't fix his son's spine. "Dad," Ethan called, his voice small against the symphony of children's laughter. "Can we go now?" Richard looked up, surprised. They'd only been at the park for 15 minutes. The physical therapist had recommended outdoor time, exposure to other children. "Are you sure, buddy? We just got here." Ethan's eyes, blue like his mother's, fixed on a group of boys tossing a football. One had looked over, whispered something, and the others had laughed. It wasn't the first time. "I'm sure." As Richard pocketed his phone and moved toward his son, a small figure darted across the playground. A girl, perhaps 8 years old, with untamed red curls and a faded yellow dress. She stopped directly in front of Ethan's wheelchair. "Hi, I'm Lucy," she announced, breathless. "Wanna play I Spy?" Ethan stared, speechless. No child had directly approached him since the accident. "I can't really play much," Ethan finally said, gesturing at his wheelchair. Lucy's freckled face scrunched in confusion. "I Spy doesn't need legs, silly. It needs eyes." She tapped her own. "You got those, right?" A smile, small but real, tugged at Ethan's lips. "Yeah, I got those." Richard watched, frozen, as this little hurricane of energy transformed his son before his eyes. Ethan was smiling, actually smiling. He hadn't seen that in months. "Who are you here with?" Richard finally asked, looking around for the girl's parents. "Mrs. Wilson." Lucy pointed toward an older woman sitting on a bench, watching several children. "She's my foster mom for now." Foster mom for now. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. As Lucy led Ethan in an enthusiastic game of I Spy, Richard observed Mrs. Wilson, grey-haired, tired, watching too many children at once. His investigative instincts kicked in, honed by years of business deals and acquisitions. There was a story here. An hour later, when Richard finally interrupted to say they needed to go, Ethan's protest was immediate. "But Dad, Lucy and I are making up stories about the clouds." "You could come back tomorrow," Lucy suggested, her green eyes hopeful. "I come here every Tuesday and Thursday." Before Richard could respond, Ethan looked up at him with more life in his eyes than Richard had seen since the accident. "Can we, Dad? Please?" What happened next would change all their lives forever. Richard Matthews was not a man accustomed to making impulsive decisions. Every aspect of his business empire had been built on calculated risks, careful planning, and strategic foresight. Yet here he was, approaching a foster mother on a park bench, his heart racing like he was a nervous intern again instead of the CEO of Matthews Technologies. "Mrs. Wilson?" he asked, extending his hand. "I'm Richard Matthews, Ethan's father." The older woman looked up, momentary confusion giving way to recognition. "Oh, your boy and Lucy seem to have hit it off." Her smile was warm but tired, the kind that had seen too much of life's hardships. "They certainly have," Richard agreed, watching as Lucy pushed Ethan's wheelchair around the perimeter of the playground, pointing out interesting stones and fallen leaves. I haven't seen my son this animated in months. Mrs. Wilson's eyes softened. Lucy has that effect on people. That child could make friends with the fence post. She chuckled, then her expression grew more serious. Your boy, the wheelchair. Car accident 2 years ago, Richard said, the words still difficult to speak aloud. My wife was driving. She walked away without a scratch. Ethan's spinal cord was damaged. He didn't mention the divorce that followed 6 months later, or how Jessica had moved to California, unable to face the daily reminder of what had happened, unable to face their son. I'm sorry, Mrs. Wilson said simply. Richard nodded, then took a deep breath. Mrs. Wilson, I'd like to invite you and Lucy to dinner this weekend as a thank you. The invitation clearly surprised her. Mr. Matthews, that's very kind, but please, Richard interrupted. My son hasn't connected with anyone since the accident. What Lucy did today. He paused, emotion threatening to overtake him. It means more than I can express. After a moment's consideration, Mrs. Wilson nodded. Sunday would work. I have 5 foster children currently, but Lucy is the only one without a weekend visitation scheduled. 5 children. Richard tried to hide his shock. Sunday is perfect. I'll send a car for you both. As they exchanged contact information, Lucy wheeled Ethan back toward them, both children laughing. Dad, Lucy knows all about constellations. She's going to teach me so we can stargaze. Richard's throat tightened. Ethan had always been fascinated by stars. Before the accident, they'd had a telescope set up in their backyard observatory. It had sat unused since that rainy night when everything changed. That sounds wonderful, buddy. Later that evening, as Richard tucked Ethan into bed, his son clutched his stuffed astronaut toy, a relic from better days. Dad? Yes, Ethan? Lucy said her parents are in heaven. Is that where Mom is too? Richard froze, unprepared for the question. No, buddy. Mom's in California, remember, she needed some time. Ethan's eyes, wise beyond their years, held his father's gaze. Lucy said sometimes people leave because they're sad, not because they don't love you. As Richard drove to work the next morning, he couldn't stop thinking about Lucy's words. What exactly had happened to this child who seemed to understand loss so profoundly? And why did he feel so strongly that she had entered their lives for a reason? Sunday dinner at the Matthews mansion was unlike anything Lucy had ever experienced. Her eyes widened as the chauffeur-driven car passed through wrought-iron gates and up a winding driveway lined with perfectly manicured trees. Mrs. Wilson squeezed her hand, a silent reminder of their brief conversation about best behavior. It's like a castle, Lucy whispered as they approached the stone mansion. Richard and Ethan greeted them at the door, Ethan's wheelchair positioned at the perfect height for him to high-five Lucy. I thought maybe you wouldn't come, Ethan admitted as Lucy bent down to hug him. I never break promises, Lucy said with the solemn certainty only children can muster. Richard led them on a tour, carefully navigating to areas accessible by wheelchair. Lucy marveled at everything. The indoor swimming pool with its special lift for Ethan, the movie theater with seats that could be removed to accommodate his wheelchair, the sprawling kitchen where their personal chef, Marco, was preparing dinner. Do you have any food allergies, Miss Lucy? Marco asked with a wink. Lucy shook her head. I eat everything except green peppers. They taste like sad thoughts. The adults laughed, but Ethan nodded seriously. They totally do. During dinner, Richard observed the children's easy interaction. Lucy naturally included Ethan, never making his disability the focus, yet accommodating it without drawing attention. She'd reach for things just beyond his grasp, suggest games they could play together, all without making him feel limited. After dessert, a spectacular chocolate fountain that had Lucy bouncing in her seat, Richard invited Mrs. Wilson into his study while the children watched a movie in the theater. Mr. Matthews, Mrs. Wilson began once they were seated. I feel I should explain Lucy's situation." Richard nodded, pouring her a cup of tea from the service his housekeeper had prepared. "Lucy's parents died in a house fire last year. She was staying with a neighbor for a sleepover. That's the only reason she survived." Mrs. Wilson's voice caught. "She has no other family willing to take her. She's been in 3 foster homes before mine. 3? In just a year?" Richard couldn't hide his shock. Mrs. Wilson sighed. "The first family decided they weren't prepared for a child with her emotional needs. The second had a family emergency and could no longer foster. I'm her 3rd placement." And is your home stable for her?" Richard asked carefully. Mrs. Wilson's smile was sad. "I do my best, Mr. Matthews, but I'm 67 years old with 5 foster children and a fixed income. The state provides some support, but—" She trailed off. "Lucy deserves so much more than I can give her." As if summoned by their conversation, peals of laughter echoed from the theater down the hall. Ethan's laugh, a sound Richard had feared he might never hear again. "She's special," Richard said quietly. "Very," Mrs. Wilson agreed. "She's been through so much, yet she remains so open-hearted. Most children in her situation build walls." When it was time to leave, Ethan's distress was palpable. "Can't Lucy stay for a sleepover?" "Not tonight, buddy," Richard said gently, "but I've arranged something else." He knelt beside both children. "Lucy, how would you like to come play with Ethan after school 3 days a week? I've already spoken with Mrs. Wilson, and if you're interested, my driver can pick you up." Lucy's face lit up brighter than the chandeliers overhead. "Really? For real?" "For real," Richard confirmed, something unfamiliar and warm blooming in his chest as he watched the children's excitement. What Richard didn't say, what he couldn't yet say, was that meeting Lucy had awakened something in him that had been dormant since the accident. A sense of purpose, beyond work, beyond mere survival. As he watched the car disappear down his driveway, his phone buzzed with a text from his lawyer. "Background check complete. Call me." Lucy's presence transformed the Matthews home like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. 3 afternoons a week turned into 4, then 5. Richard arranged for his work schedule to accommodate Lucy's visits, finding himself increasingly drawn to the living room where the children played, rather than the isolation of his home office. Dr. Bennett, Ethan's physical therapist, noticed the change immediately. "His upper body strength has improved dramatically," she told Richard during their weekly session, 6 weeks after Lucy first entered their lives. "And his motivation. I've never seen him work this hard." Richard watched through the glass as Lucy cheered Ethan on, the boy straining to complete his exercises. "She challenges him," Richard explained. "Yesterday, she built an obstacle course and timed how fast he could navigate it in his wheelchair." Dr. Bennett smiled. "Whatever she's doing, it's working. Have you considered getting him involved in adaptive sports? The community center has a wheelchair basketball program for kids. 2 years of doctors, specialists, and therapists, and no one had mentioned this possibility. Or perhaps they had, and Richard hadn't been ready to hear it. "I'll look into it," he promised. That evening, Richard sat in his study, reviewing the extensive background report his private investigator had compiled on Lucy Henderson. Born to Mark and Susan Henderson, both schoolteachers, no living grandparents, one maternal aunt in Seattle who had declined guardianship after the fire, citing her own health issues. Excellent student, despite changing schools 3 times in the past year. And then there was the most troubling information. Mrs. Wilson had stage 2 breast cancer. She'd begun treatment 2 weeks ago and was struggling to maintain her foster care responsibilities. According to Richard's source, the state was considering redistributing her foster children to other homes. Lucy would be moved again, away from the only stability she'd known since losing her parents, away from Ethan. The thought made Richard's chest tight. His phone rang. Jessica, his ex-wife, making her monthly check-in call. She'd left Vermont after the divorce, unable to face the daily reminder of the accident that had paralyzed their son while she'd been driving. Monthly calls and twice-yearly visits were all she could manage, consumed by guilt that no amount of therapy seemed to touch. "How is he?" she asked, as always. "Better," Richard said, and for the first time it wasn't just a platitude to ease her conscience. "Much better, actually. He's made a friend." The silence on the other end stretched until Richard wondered if the call had dropped. "A friend?" Jessica finally said, her voice thick. Richard told her about Lucy, about the transformation in their son. For once, Jessica listened without interrupting, without steering the conversation toward her own grief. "She sounds remarkable," Jessica said when he finished. "I'm glad he has her." After they hung up, Richard sat staring at the folder of information, a decision crystallizing in his mind. It was impulsive, possibly crazy, definitely complicated, everything his business advisors would warn against. But for the first time since the accident, he felt certain about something beyond balance sheets and profit margins. The next morning, he called his lawyer. "I want to become Lucy Henderson's foster parent," he said without preamble. The silence that followed was deafening. "Richard," his lawyer finally said, "do you understand what you're asking? The home studies? The background checks? The scrutiny of your personal life?" "I do." "And you're prepared for the possibility that this could be temporary, that family members could come forward, or the court could determine it's not in her best interest?" Richard thought of Ethan's laugh, of Lucy's unflagging spirit, of the light she had brought back into their home. "Some things are worth the risk, Jim. Start the paperwork." Nay, what Richard couldn't have anticipated was how quickly things would unravel. 3 days later, Mrs. Wilson was hospitalized with complications from her treatment. By week's end, Lucy and the other foster children were scheduled for emergency placement reviews, and Richard was nowhere near approved as a foster parent. The social worker's office felt unnaturally small to Richard, accustomed as he was to his spacious corner suite with its floor-to-ceiling windows. Here, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The chairs were utilitarian rather than ergonomic, and the desk between them was cluttered with stacks of files, lives reduced to paperwork. "Mr. Matthews," Ms. Patel began, adjusting her glasses, "while I appreciate your interest in fostering Lucy, I must be frank, we have protocols that can't be circumvented, even for someone of your resources." Richard leaned forward. "I understand the process takes time. But Lucy's being displaced now, today. Mrs. Wilson's medical situation has created an emergency. Yes, and we have emergency placement families for precisely these situations. Families Lucy doesn't know. She's already lost her parents, been moved 3 times in a year, and now she's losing Mrs. Wilson. The trauma is precisely why we need to ensure proper placement." Ms. Patel interrupted. "Mr. Matthews, your home study hasn't even begun. You're a single father with a special needs child and a demanding career. The courts will question your capacity to care for another child, particularly one with Lucy's history of trauma." Richard's jaw clenched. In business, obstacles were merely puzzles to be solved, negotiations to be won. But this wasn't business. This was Lucy, bright, resilient Lucy, who had brought his son back to life. "What if it were temporary?" he suggested. "Emergency placement while I complete the formal process?" Ms. Patel's expression softened slightly. "That would still require expedited background checks, home safety inspections, and court approval." "I've already submitted to background checks," Richard said, sliding a folder across the desk. "My lawyer compiled these, and I can have my home ready for inspection by this afternoon." Ms. Patel raised an eyebrow, but accepted the folder. "You've been preparing for this." Since the day I met her, Richard admitted. As Ms. Patel reviewed the documents, Richard's phone vibrated. A text from Ethan's caregiver. He very upset. Heard Elle might be leaving. Refusing therapy. Richard's heart sank. He hadn't told Ethan about Mrs. Wilson's hospitalization or the possibility of Lucy being relocated. Somehow, he'd found out anyway. Mr. Matthews. Ms. Patel's voice pulled him back. These preliminary checks seem in order, but there's another consideration. She hesitated. Lucy's aunt in Seattle has reconsidered taking guardianship. She contacted us yesterday. And the news hit Richard like a physical blow. The same aunt who refused initially. What changed? She's recovered from her health issues and feels ready now. As a blood relative, she has priority. Richard's mind raced. The aunt lived across the country. If Lucy went to Seattle, Ethan might never see her again. Has Lucy been informed? He asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. Not yet. We're arranging a video call for them to meet first. Richard stood, needing to move, to think. Ms. Patel, I'm not trying to separate Lucy from her family, but she and my son have formed a significant bond. Ethan's made more progress with her in his life than in 2 years of intensive therapy. And Lucy, she smiles with him, she laughs. She needs that stability right now. Miss Patel sighed, removing her glasses. Mr. Matthews, I've been doing this job for 23 years. Every case is unique, but they all have one thing in common. There are no perfect solutions, only the least imperfect ones. She replaced her glasses. I'll expedite your application and home inspection. In the meantime, Lucy will be placed temporarily with one of our emergency families. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Richard thanked her and left, his mind already formulating a plan B, C, and D. He hadn't built his company by accepting initial rejections. Outside the building, he called his assistant. Cancel my meetings for the week and contact the Seattle office. I need everything they can find on Janet Porter, Lucy Henderson's aunt. When he arrived home, he found Ethan in his bedroom, red-eyed and adamant. We can't let them take Lucy away. She belongs with us. I'm doing everything I can, buddy, Richard promised, his heart breaking at his son's distress. It's not enough, Ethan shouted, pounding his fists against his wheelchair armrests. You're Richard Matthews. You can do anything. The outburst stunned Richard. Ethan had never raised his voice since the accident, had become almost preternaturally calm, as if anger required energy he no longer possessed. Ethan. Lucy understands me, Ethan continued, his voice cracking. She doesn't look at me like I'm broken. She makes up games I can play. His words dissolved into sobs. Richard gathered his son into his arms, wheelchair and all, holding him as he hadn't done since he was small. I promise you, he whispered fiercely, I will not let Lucy disappear from our lives, whatever it takes. That night, after Ethan finally fell asleep, Richard made a call he'd been avoiding. Jessica, I need your help. Lucy sat on her small bed in the Collins home, carefully arranging her few possessions. The emergency foster family seemed nice enough. Mrs. Collins had made her favorite dinner. How did she know spaghetti was her favorite? And Mr. Collins had shown her their backyard with its tire swing. Their own children were grown, they'd explained, but they kept the swing for their grandchildren's visits. Lucy had smiled and thanked them politely, just as Mrs. Wilson had taught her. But inside, her heart felt heavy as a stone. This was her 4th home in 13 months. She was getting good at packing, at smiling, at pretending everything was fine when nothing was fine at all. Lucy? Mrs. Collins called softly from the doorway. You have visitors. Lucy looked up, confused. Visitors? She had no family, and her friends from school never visited her foster homes. But there in the doorway, behind Mrs. Collins, was Richard Matthews. and being wheeled in beside him was Ethan, clutching a small gift bag. "Ethan!" Lucy cried, running to hug her friend. "Mr. Matthews, you came!" "Of course we came," Richard said, his voice gruff with emotion. "We couldn't let a day go by without seeing you." Mrs. Collins smiled warmly. "I'll leave you to visit. There are cookies in the kitchen when you're ready." Once she'd gone, Lucy peppered them with questions. How had they found her? Was Mrs. Wilson okay? Had they visited her in the hospital? When could Lucy come visit the mansion again? "Actually," Richard said, sitting on the edge of the bed while Ethan presented Lucy with the gift bag, "that's what we wanted to talk to you about." Inside the bag was a small silver frame containing a photo of Lucy and Ethan from their day at the Science Museum. Both were beaming at the camera, Lucy standing behind Ethan's wheelchair, her arms draped over his shoulders in a casual hug. "It's for your nightstand," Ethan explained, "so you don't forget us." "I could never forget you," Lucy said fiercely. "Never, ever." Richard cleared his throat. "Lucy, I've been talking with Ms. Patel, your social worker. I've applied to become your foster parent." Lucy's eyes widened. "You mean I could live with you and Ethan, in the big house?" "If that's what you want," Richard said carefully, "and if the court approves. It might take some time, and there are some complications." "My aunt in Seattle," Lucy said, surprising them both. "Ms. Patel told me she wants me now." Richard nodded. "Have you spoken with her yet?" "We did a video call yesterday. She seems nice. She has cats." Lucy's voice was flat, emotionless. "She said I'd have my own room with a window seat." Richard and Ethan exchanged glances. This was the first they'd heard of the call having already taken place. "And how do you feel about going to Seattle?" Richard asked gently. Lucy shrugged, her small shoulders carrying the weight of too many decisions made for her, too many changes beyond her control. "Aunt Janet is my mum's sister. She has the same eyes." "Lucy," Ethan said suddenly, his voice urgent, "do you want to go to Seattle?" Lucy looked at her friend, the boy who had accepted her completely, who never complained despite his paralysis, who had shown her it was possible to find joy even after terrible loss. Tears welled in her eyes. "I want to stay with you," she whispered. "But Ms. Patel said family is most important. Aunt Janet is my only family left." Richard knelt before Lucy, taking her small hands in his. "Lucy, family isn't just blood. Family is the people who love you, who show up for you, who make space in their lives for you." He squeezed her hands gently. "Ethan and we're your family too now, if you want us to be." Lucy's tears spilled over. "But what if the court says no? What if they make me go to Seattle anyway?" Richard's jaw set with determination. "Then we'll visit you in Seattle. We'll video call every day. We'll make sure you're never alone no matter what happens." What Richard didn't say, couldn't say, was that Jessica was already in Seattle, meeting with Janet Porter. That his ex-wife, who could barely face her own son, had flown across the country to help them keep Lucy in their lives. That the full resources of Matthew's technologies were being deployed to ensure Lucy had choices no 7-year-old should have to make. Instead, he simply held Lucy as she cried, as Ethan reached from his wheelchair to pat her back, as promises were made that adults might not be able to keep. Later, as they prepared to leave, Lucy walked them to the Collins front door. "Mr. Matthews?" she asked, her voice small but steady. "What happens next?" Richard crouched to meet her eyes. "Next, we fight for what matters most." Outside in the car, Ethan was uncharacteristically quiet. Finally, as they pulled into their driveway, he spoke. "Dad, are we going to lose Lucy like we lost Mom?" Richard turned to face his son, his heart breaking anew at the fear in those young eyes. "No, buddy. Your mom left because she couldn't face what happened. But Lucy runs toward the hard things, not away from them. And so will we." Jessica Matthews stared at the Seattle skyline from her hotel window, rain streaking the glass like tears. She'd spent the morning rehearsing what to say to Janet Porter, Lucy's aunt. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd abandoned her own child, yet here she was, fighting for another child's future. Her phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "How are you holding up?" After their divorce, they'd communicated strictly through lawyers. Then, only brief messages about Ethan. Now, they were allies in a cause bigger than their broken marriage. "Nervous," she replied, "meeting in an hour." Janet Porter's modest apartment was in a well-kept building near the university where she worked as an administrator. Jessica noted the cat-themed welcome mat, remembering Lucy's comment about the cats. Janet answered on the second knock, her resemblance to Lucy striking, the same auburn hair, though Janet's was streaked with grey, the same green eyes, though Janet's held a wariness Lucy's lacked. "Mrs. Matthews?" Janet's confusion was evident. "I was expecting someone from Vermont Social Services." "May I come in?" Jessica asked. "I've come a long way to speak with you about Lucy." Inside, the apartment was neat but cramped. Photos of Lucy's mother, Janet's sister, adorned the walls. Two cats watched Jessica suspiciously from the couch. "You're not with Social Services," Janet stated once they were seated. "No," Jessica admitted. "I'm the ex-wife of Richard Matthews, the man applying to foster Lucy." Janet's expression hardened. "So he sent his ex-wife to convince me to back off. That's a bit desperate, isn't it?" Jessica shook her head. "Richard doesn't know exactly what I'm going to say to you. This isn't about him. It's about Lucy and my son, Ethan." As Jessica explained the bond that had formed between the children, Janet listened silently, her fingers absently stroking a cat that had settled in her lap. "Mrs. Matthews," Janet finally said, "I appreciate that your son has formed an attachment to Lucy. But she's my niece, my only family since Susan died. I wasn't in a position to take her immediately after the fire, but I am now." "And where were you the past year?" Jessica regretted the words as soon as they escaped. Janet's eyes flashed. "I was undergoing chemotherapy, breast cancer, stage 2. Would you have wanted your niece to watch you vomit every day, lose your hair, lose your dignity? To risk exposing her to a compromised immune system?" Jessica's heart sank. Mrs. Wilson, Lucy's current foster mother, was battling the same disease. "I'm sorry," Jessica said quietly. "I didn't know." "No, you didn't," Janet's voice softened. "But I'm in remission now. My doctors say the prognosis is excellent. I can give Lucy a stable home, connection to her mother's memory, family history." She gestured to the photos on the wall. "What can your ex-husband give her that I can't?" Jessica thought of Ethan's face when he spoke of Lucy during their video calls, animated in a way she hadn't seen since before the accident. "A brother," Jessica said simply. "Someone who needs her as much as she needs him." Janet's expression changed, something unreadable crossing her face. "Lucy had a brother, you know. He would have been Ethan's age." Jessica's breath caught. "I didn't know." "He died when he was 3, congenital heart defect. Susan, my sister, never fully recovered from losing him." "Maybe that's why Lucy connected so strongly with your son." Janet's eyes glistened. "She remembers Daniel, even though she was just 4 when he died." The revelation hung between them, heavy with implications. Lucy wasn't just an orphan who'd lost her parents. She was a sister who'd lost her brother too. "Janet," Jessica said carefully, "what if there was a way for Lucy to have both, her aunt and the Matthews family?" Back in Vermont, Richard paced the foyer as the Social Services Home Inspector examined every inch of the mansion. Ms. Patel followed with her clipboard, occasionally making notes. "The house is certainly spacious, Ms." Patel commented, "and the accessibility modifications for Ethan are impressive, but Lucy would need her own space, Mr. Matthews." "I've prepared a room for her," Richard led them upstairs to a bedroom adjacent to Ethan's, recently redecorated with input from his interior designer and Ethan's memories of Lucy's preferences. The walls were a soft yellow, Lucy's favorite color. A window seat overlooked the gardens. Bookshelves held titles Richard had noticed Lucy gravitate toward during her visits. A telescope stood by the window, a nod to the stargazing she and Ethan enjoyed. Ms. Patel raised an eyebrow. "You've gone to considerable expense for a placement that isn't guaranteed." Richard met her gaze steadily. "Lucy deserves this level of consideration, regardless of the outcome." His phone vibrated in his pocket. A message from Jessica. "Found common ground. Call me." As Ms. Patel continued her inspection, Richard's mind raced with possibilities. Whatever Jessica had discovered in Seattle might change everything. Meanwhile, at the Collins home, Lucy sat cross-legged on her bed, writing carefully in a journal Mrs. Collins had given her. At the top of the page, she'd written, "Reasons to stay in Vermont versus reasons to go to Seattle." The list was long on both sides. Seattle had Aunt Janet, her mother's photos, cats, and her parents' memory. Vermont had Ethan, Mr. Matthews, the mansion, and her new school friends. Lucy chewed her pencil, torn between the family she'd lost and the one she'd found. At 8 years old, she'd already learned life's cruelest lesson. Sometimes there are no perfect choices. "I'm telling you, Richard, she's not what we expected." Jessica's voice came through the speakerphone in Richard's study. "Janet Porter genuinely cares about Lucy." Richard ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion etched on his face. The home inspection had gone well, but Ms. Patel had been clear. Lucy's blood relative had priority if she was deemed suitable. "Define genuinely cares," Richard said, unable to keep the edge from his voice. Jessica sighed. "She has photos of Lucy everywhere, knows her favorite books, foods, even the names of her stuffed animals from before the fire. And there's something else. Lucy had a brother who died young, a brother Ethan's age." The revelation hit Richard like a physical blow. No wonder Lucy had connected so immediately with Ethan. She wasn't just being kind to a disabled child. She was reclaiming something she'd lost. "What does this mean for us?" Richard asked. "It means Janet has a legitimate claim beyond biology," Jessica admitted, "but she's not unreasonable. She suggested a compromise. Lucy splits her time, school years in Vermont, summers and holidays in Seattle. Split custody between a biological aunt and a non-relative foster parent? Richard scoffed. "No court would approve that arrangement." "Maybe not typically," Jessica agreed, "but you're not a typical foster parent, Richard. You have resources, influence, and Janet's priority is Lucy's happiness." After the call ended, Richard sat motionless, staring at the family photo on his desk. Himself, Jessica, and Ethan before the accident. They'd been so happy once. So unaware of how quickly everything could change. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Ethan wheeled himself into the study, his expression solemn. "Is Lucy coming home?" he asked without preamble. Richard's heart ached at the hope in his son's eyes. "It's complicated, buddy. Lucy's aunt wants her to live in Seattle." Ethan's face fell. "But that's not fair. Lucy wants to be here with us. She told me so." "Sometimes what we want isn't possible," Richard said gently. "Like when I wanted to walk again?" Ethan's question hung in the air, devastating in its simplicity. Richard knelt beside the wheelchair. "Ethan, your injury—" "I know, Dad," Ethan interrupted. "The doctors explained everything. My spine won't heal." His small hands gripped the wheelchair arms. "But that doesn't mean I stopped trying other things. You got me the special controllers so I could play video games. We modified my bike so I could still ride. We find ways." Richard stared at his son, struck by the wisdom in those young eyes. "So," Ethan continued, "what's our way to keep Lucy?" The next day, the video call with Lucy was scheduled for 4 p.m. Richard had arranged for his attorney to be present, as well as Ms. Patel and, from Seattle, Janet Porter and a Washington state social worker. At 3:58, Ethan wheeled himself into Richard's home office, dressed in his best button-down shirt. "I want to be here," he said firmly. "Lucy's my best friend." Before Richard could respond, the call connected. Lucy appeared on screen, sitting beside Janet in her Seattle apartment. She looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable. "Hi, Lucy," Ethan said immediately. "I miss you." Lucy's smile was tinged with sadness. "I miss you too. Aunt Janet has cats, though. The orange one sleeps on my bed." Janet placed a gentle hand on Lucy's shoulder. "Lucy's been helping me decorate her room here," she explained. "Though we understand this is just a visit for now, until the courts decide." Ms. Patel cleared her throat. "That's correct. We're here to discuss possible arrangements for Lucy's permanent placement. Mr. Matthews has completed his initial application for fostering, and Ms. Porter's home study in Washington is underway." Richard watched Lucy's face as the adults discussed her future. She seemed to shrink with each formal term, each reference to placement and custody. "Excuse me?" Ethan interrupted suddenly. "Nobody's asking what Lucy wants." All eyes turned to the boy in the wheelchair. "Well?" Ethan pressed. "Lucy, what do you want?" Lucy looked from Janet to the screen, to the social workers, her lower lip trembling. "I don't want to choose," she whispered. "I don't want to lose anyone else." The simplicity of her answer silenced the room. Janet wiped away a tear. Richard felt his own eyes burning. Ms. Patel leaned forward. "Lucy, no one expects you to choose. The adults will—" "But it is my life," Lucy said, her voice stronger. "My mom used to say we can't control what happens to us, but we can control how we face it." She straightened her small shoulders. "I want to try Aunt Jessica's idea. Part-time in Seattle, part-time in Vermont." Janet gasped softly. "Lucy, honey, how do you know about that?" Lucy's eyes met Janet's. "I heard you on the phone. You said Mr. Matthews is rich enough to fly me back and forth 100 times a year if he wanted." Despite everything, Richard found himself smiling. Lucy was certainly observant. "Lucy," Ms. Patel said gently, "custody arrangements like that are very unusual between non-related parties." "Then make it usual," Lucy replied with the simple logic of a child. "Please." As the call ended, Richard felt a flicker of hope. Lucy wanted to maintain connections with both families. Janet seemed willing to consider an unconventional arrangement. Even the social workers appeared thoughtful rather than dismissive. But that night, as Richard checked on Ethan before bed, he found his son staring at the ceiling, tears streaming silently down his face. "What is it, buddy?" Richard asked, alarmed. "What if she forgets us?" Ethan whispered. "What if she likes Seattle better?" Richard had no answer that wouldn't feel like an empty promise. Instead, he simply held his son's hand until he fell asleep, the question lingering unanswered between them. The courthouse in Burlington intimidated despite its modest size. Richard adjusted his tie, glancing at Ethan beside him in his wheelchair. The boy had insisted on wearing a suit to look serious for the judge, he'd explained. Jessica sat on Ethan's other side, having flown in from California the previous night. Her presence had surprised the courthouse staff, who'd scrambled to update their records when she'd announced she was supporting her ex-husband's petition. "Are you nervous, Dad?" Ethan whispered as they waited for the judge. Richard managed to smile. "A little. But we've done everything we can." The truth was more complicated. The previous weeks had been a whirlwind of legal motions, home studies and negotiations. Janet Porter had arrived from Seattle 3 days ago, staying in a hotel downtown. Lucy remained with the Collins family, visiting both Janet and the Matthews household under supervision. The door opened, and Judge Eleanor Winters entered. In her 60s, with steel-grey hair and piercing eyes, she had a reputation for prioritizing children's welfare over procedural convenience. "This is an unusual case," she began without preamble. "I have a petition from Mr. Richard Matthews to become a foster parent to Lucy Henderson with an eventual goal of adoption. I have a competing petition from Miss Janet Porter, the child's maternal aunt, for full custody. I also have—" She peered over her glasses. "A highly irregular joint proposal from both parties for split physical custody across state lines." She shuffled her papers. "Before I hear arguments, I want to be clear. My only concern is Lucy's welfare, not adult convenience, not legal precedent, and certainly not the considerable financial resources that have clearly been deployed." Her gaze fixed on Richard's legal team. Richard's lead attorney rose. "Your Honor, my client understands this is an unconventional request. However, we believe it represents the best solution for a child who has already experienced significant loss and disruption." Janet Porter's attorney followed. "Ms. Porter agrees with Mr. Matthews on this point, Your Honor. While she believes she can provide Lucy with family connection and stability, she recognizes the bond Lucy has formed with the Matthews family, particularly with Ethan Matthews." Judge Winters listened to both arguments, occasionally making notes. When the attorneys finished, she leaned forward. "I'd like to hear from the adults personally involved. Mr. Matthews, why should I consider this arrangement instead of placing Lucy with her blood relative?" Richard stood, heart pounding. In business, he negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat. But this mattered more than anything he'd ever fought for. "Your Honor, when Lucy first spoke to my son at the playground, she didn't see his wheelchair. She saw him. Since that day, she's become essential to our family. Ethan's physical and emotional progress has been remarkable. Their connection transcends a typical friendship. And you believe splitting Lucy's time between two households in different states is in her best interest?" Richard hesitated, then answered honestly. "I believe having Lucy in our lives in any capacity is better than losing her entirely. And I believe Lucy feels the same about maintaining her connection with her aunt." Judge Winters turned to Janet. "Ms. Porter, you've undergone cancer treatment and are now in remission. Are you confident in your ability to provide consistent care for Lucy?" Janet nodded. "My prognosis is excellent, Your Honor. My medical team has provided documentation of my fitness. And while I initially couldn't care for Lucy due to my health, I've never stopped wanting her in my life. Yet you're willing to share custody with a man who was a stranger to Lucy until recently." "I've seen how she lights up when she talks about Ethan," Janet said simply. "My sister, Lucy's mother, would have wanted her daughter to be happy, not just physically cared for." The judge made another note, then fixed her gaze on Jessica. "Mrs. Matthews, you and Mr. Matthews are divorced, correct? Yet you're supporting his petition?" Jessica straightened. "Yes, Your Honor. Yes, Our marriage ended, but our commitment to children's welfare didn't. Lucy deserves every possible chance at happiness." Judge Winters nodded, then surprised everyone. "I'd like to speak with Lucy privately in my chambers, and Ethan Matthews as well, if he's comfortable with that." 30 minutes later, Lucy and Ethan returned to the courtroom. Lucy took her seat beside Ms. Patel, while Ethan wheeled himself back to his parents. His expression was unreadable. "Having reviewed all documentation and spoken with the children," Judge Winters began, "I'm prepared to render a temporary decision, subject to review in 6 months." She adjusted her glasses. "This case presents unique circumstances that warrant a unique solution." Richard held his breath. Beside him, Jessica reached for his hand, a gesture so unexpected, so reminiscent of their earlier life together, that he almost pulled away. Instead, he gripped her fingers tightly. "I am approving the joint custody arrangement on a provisional basis," Judge Winters announced. "Lucy will reside primarily with Mr. Matthews during the school year, with Ms. Porter having visitation rights. During summer months and certain holidays, Lucy will reside with Miss Porter in Seattle. Relief flooded Richard, but the judge wasn't finished. However, she continued, this arrangement is conditional on all parties committing to Lucy's emotional stability. Any sign that this arrangement is causing her distress will trigger immediate review. Her gaze swept the courtroom. Is that understood? Everyone nodded. Then court is adjourned. Mr. Matthews, Ms. Porter, I'll see you in 6 months. Outside the courthouse, as reporters gathered, Lucy stood between Janet and Richard, looking overwhelmed. Ethan wheeled closer, reaching for her hand. See, we found a way, he said quietly, just like I told you we would. Summer arrived with unforgiving heat. The Matthews mansion, despite its state-of-the-art cooling system, felt oddly empty. Lucy had been in Seattle with Janet for 3 weeks, the first significant separation since the court's decision 4 months earlier. Richard found Ethan in Lucy's room, holding the worn teddy bear she'd left behind. She's coming back next Thursday, Richard reminded him gently. That's only 9 days away. Ethan nodded without looking up. I know, but she's missing the adaptive swimming competition. Coach says I have a chance at a medal. The adaptive sports programs had transformed Ethan. Swimming, wheelchair basketball, even modified archery. He'd embraced them all with determination that astonished his therapists. Lucy had attended every practice, every game, cheering louder than anyone. We'll record everything, Richard promised, and maybe we can FaceTime her during the medal ceremony. Ethan's weekly video calls with Lucy had become a household fixture, scheduled around the 3-hour time difference. Today's call was special, Lucy's 9th birthday. Richard had arranged for gifts to be delivered to Janet's apartment and had helped Ethan create a video montage of their adventures together. But when the call connected that evening, Lucy's face told them something was wrong. What is it, sweetheart? Richard asked immediately. Lucy glanced over her shoulder, then whispered, Aunt Janet's been sick again. She won't say it. But I heard her throwing up yesterday, and she's sleeping a lot. Richard and Ethan exchanged alarmed looks. Janet's cancer, was it back? Where is she now? Richard asked. Sleeping. She said she just needed to rest before my birthday dinner, but we were supposed to go an hour ago. Lucy's lower lip trembled. I'm scared. Richard's mind raced. Lucy, do you know if Janet has a friend we could call or her doctor's number? Lucy shook her head. But her phone is on the coffee table. I could look. Good thinking, Richard encouraged. Can you do that now? While Lucy went to check, Richard turned to Ethan. I need to make some calls. Will you stay on with Lucy? Ethan nodded solemnly. Don't worry, Dad. I'll keep her calm. By midnight, Richard had mobilized resources that would have impressed his business associates. Janet's oncologist had been located and advised of the situation. A neighbor with a spare key had checked on the apartment and found Janet severely dehydrated. An ambulance had transported her to the hospital, and Richard's corporate jet was being prepared for an early morning flight to Seattle. Pack your bag, buddy, Richard told Ethan as he ended his last call. We're going to Seattle. Ethan's eyes widened. Really? But what about my therapy sessions and your big meeting? Some things are more important, Richard said simply. The next morning, as they boarded the plane, Richard received a text from the social worker he'd contacted in Seattle. Janet asking for you. Says it's urgent. 12 hours after Lucy's birthday call, Richard wheeled Ethan into Janet Porter's hospital room. Lucy was curled in a chair beside the bed, clutching a stuffed cat. Her face lit up when she saw them. You came! She flung herself at Ethan, then at Richard. I knew you would. Janet looked smaller somehow, diminished against the white hospital sheets. Her auburn hair, which she'd been growing back after her treatments, seemed thinner. Richard, she said, her voice weak but determined, we need to talk. Alone. Lucy took Ethan to the cafeteria, promising to find ice cream. When they were gone, Janet pushed herself to sitting position. The cancer's back, she said without preamble. Stage of 4. It spread to my liver. Richard felt the floor shift beneath him. Janet, I'm so sorry. What can I do? You can take Lucy, Janet replied, her eyes filling. Permanently, the shared custody, it was a beautiful dream, but it's not sustainable now. We'll figure something out, Richard started, but Janet shook her head. Don't offer platitudes, Richard. I'm dying. The doctors give me 6 months, maybe a year, with aggressive treatment. Ade, she reached for a folder on her bedside table. I've already updated my will, naming you as Lucy's guardian. I've also prepared adoption paperwork, if you still want her. If I still... Richard stopped, overcome. Janet, of course we want her, but this isn't how it was supposed to happen. Lucy needs you in her life. Janet's smile was sad. And I needed more time. Funny how rarely we get what we need. She closed her eyes briefly. Do you know what Lucy asked me yesterday? Whether she could call you Dad when she writes to Santa this year. Richard's throat tightened. She loves you, Janet continued. You and Ethan. You've given her a family when she thought she'd lost everything. She reached for Richard's hand. Promise me you'll tell her about Susan and Mark, about Daniel, about me when I'm gone. I promise, Richard whispered. But Janet, you're not gone yet. We can bring Lucy to visit, set up video calls during your treatment. Janet squeezed his hand weakly. I'd like that. But Richard, don't tell her how bad it is. Let her have this time without the shadow of another loss hanging over her. When Lucy and Ethan returned, ice cream smeared on both their faces, they found the adults talking quietly about practical matters. Lucy's belongings, her school registration in Vermont, Janet's treatment schedule. Can we have my birthday dinner in the hospital cafeteria? Lucy asked. They have cake. Janet smiled, the strain evident, but her love for Lucy shining through. That sounds perfect, sweetheart. Later, as the children demolished slices of chocolate cake, Janet leaned toward Richard. Thank you for coming, for being the man you are. Richard shook his head. I should be thanking you. For trusting me with the most precious person in your life. Our life, Janet corrected softly. She belongs to all of us now. Autumn painted Vermont in spectacular colors, crimson maples, golden birches, amber oaks. Lucy pressed colorful leaves between wax paper, creating decorations for Janet's hospital room in Seattle. Do you think Aunt Janet will like these? She asked Ethan, holding up a particularly vibrant maple leaf. She'll love them, Ethan assured her. They sat side by side at the kitchen table, Lucy on a regular chair, Ethan in his wheelchair. The past 2 months had settled into a new routine. Lucy lived permanently with the Matthews now, visiting Seattle once a month for long weekends. Janet's condition had stabilized temporarily with treatment, though everyone except Lucy understood the reprieve was temporary. Richard entered the kitchen, smiling at the leaf project. Those are beautiful. We'll pack them carefully for our trip next weekend. Dad? Lucy asked, the term still new enough that Richard's heart skipped each time she used it. Can we bring Aunt Janet some of Marco's soup? Hospital food is yucky. Great idea, Richard agreed. I'll ask him to prepare some for the trip. The doorbell interrupted their conversation. Richard checked his watch, frowning. That must be Miss Patel. She's early. The 6-month review of Lucy's custody arrangement was approaching. Despite Janet's legal preparations, the court required formal evaluation before approving any permanent changes. Ms. Patel entered, looking uncharacteristically hesitant. Mr. Matthews, I need to speak with you. Privately. Richard led her to his study, apprehension building. What is it? There's been a development, Ms. Patel began, setting her briefcase on his desk. Lucy's paternal grandparents have come forward, seeking custody. Richard stared, uncomprehending. That's impossible. Lucy's father had no living relatives. The background check was thorough. Mark Henderson's parents were presumed dead in a boating accident 5 years ago, Ms. Patel explained. Apparently, they were living off-grid in Alaska. They only recently learned of their son's death and Lucy's situation. Richard sank into his chair. This can't be happening. Janet has already named me guardian. The adoption paperwork is on hold, Ms. Patel finished gently. Blood relatives have priority under the law, Mr. Matthews, especially grandparents. But Lucy's settled here. She's happy. She's thriving. Ethan needs her. And Janet, how do I tell Janet? Ms. Patel placed a document on his desk. The Hendersons have requested an immediate visitation. They're in Burlington now. Richard's mind raced through possibilities, contingencies, legal maneuvers. He'd built his fortune by anticipating problems, finding solutions, but this blindsided him completely. When? He managed. Tomorrow, Ms. Patel replied. I'll supervise the meeting here, if that's acceptable. After she left, Richard sat motionless, devastation washing over him. How would he tell the children? How would he tell Janet, already fighting for her life? The shared custody arrangement had been difficult enough to secure. Now, with biological grandparents in the picture. His phone buzzed. Jessica calling from California. They spoke regularly now, their shared concern for the children healing old wounds. Richard, how did the meeting go? When he explained, Jessica's gasp was audible. That's impossible. I spoke with Mark's mother at the wedding. She talked about their boating plans. Richard straightened. You met Lucy's grandparents? Once, at Susan and Mark's wedding. His mother was difficult, very controlling. Mark had limited contact with them even then. Jessica, I need everything you can remember about them. And I need you here. Tomorrow. The next day, the Matthews household prepared for the visit with anxious energy. Lucy, told only that some relatives had been found, vacillated between excitement and apprehension. Ethan remained close to her side, unusually quiet. At precisely noon, the doorbell rang. Ms. Patel entered, accompanied by an older couple. George Henderson was tall, rigid, with military posture. His wife, Eleanor, was petite with shrewd eyes that assessed the mansion's foyer with open calculation. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, Richard greeted them with professional courtesy. Welcome to our home. Before either could respond, Jessica appeared from the living room. Hello, Eleanor. It's been a long time. Eleanor Henderson's eyes narrowed. Jessica Matthews? What are you doing here? Supporting my family, Jessica replied smoothly. How interesting that you've appeared now after being missing for years. George Henderson stepped forward. We had no way of knowing about the tragedy. We were living without technology, without connection to the outside world. Yet you managed to hire an attorney and file for custody within days of discovering your granddaughter's existence, Richard noted. Tension filled the air, broken only when Lucy entered, Ethan beside her. She approached the visitors cautiously. Are you really my dad's parents? Eleanor Henderson's demeanor transformed instantly, her voice honeyed. Yes, darling, we're your grandparents. We've come to take you home. Lucy stepped back, bumping into Ethan's wheelchair. But I am home. The courtroom was packed for the final hearing. News of the custody battle had leaked to the press, creating a media frenzy around the millionaire fighting to keep his adopted daughter against claims from long-lost grandparents. Richard adjusted his tie, glancing at his legal team. Beside him sat Janet Porter, flown in from Seattle against medical advice, determined to testify. She looked frail but resolute, her auburn hair hidden beneath a stylish scarf. Across the aisle, the Hendersons conferred with their attorney. Throughout the 3-month legal battle, they'd presented themselves as loving grandparents, denied their right to raise their only grandchild. Their story of living off-grid in Alaska after a near-death experience had garnered public sympathy, But Richard's investigators had uncovered inconsistencies. Phone records showing calls from Alaska to Vermont shortly after Lucy's parents' deaths. Financial troubles suspiciously resolved after they'd filed for custody. And most damning, a letter from Mark Henderson to a friend, discovered in Lucy's father's personal effects, detailing his decision to cut contact with his parents due to their controlling behavior. Judge Winters entered, her expression severe. "These proceedings have gone on long enough," she began. "I've reviewed all submissions and heard testimony from multiple parties. Today, we will conclude this matter with final statements and my ruling." The Hendersons' attorney went first, emphasizing the importance of biological family and traditional values. He painted Richard as a wealthy man used to buying what he wanted, Janet as a dying woman making irrational decisions, and Lucy as a confused child influenced by luxury and privilege. Richard's attorney countered with evidence of the stable, loving environment the Matthews home provided. She highlighted Ethan and Lucy's extraordinary bond, Janet's thoughtful decision to name Richard as guardian, and the questionable timing and motivation of the Hendersons' appearance. "Finally," she concluded, "I'd like to submit a late piece of evidence, with the court's permission." A video statement from Lucy Henderson herself, recorded yesterday under Ms. Patel's supervision. Judge Winters nodded. "Proceed." The courtroom screen lit up with Lucy's face. She sat straight, her expression solemn. "My name is Lucy Henderson Matthews," she began, the hyphenated name a recent development in anticipation of the adoption. "I'm 9 years old. Before I lived with Mr. Matthews and Ethan, I lived with 3 different foster families after my parents died." She took a breath. "My grandparents say they want me to live with them because we're blood family. But they never came to my mum and dad's funeral. They never sent me birthday cards. They never looked for me until they saw me on the news with Mr. Matthews." Lucy's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "Ethan is my brother now, not by blood, but by choice. Mr. Matthews is my dad now. He helps me with homework and teaches me to be brave. Aunt Janet is still my family too, even though she's sick." She leaned closer to the camera. "Judge Winters, you asked me what I wanted before. I want to stay with my family, the one I chose and the one that chose me." As the video ended, silence filled the courtroom. Even the Hendersons seemed affected, Eleanor dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Judge Winters removed her glasses. "I've heard enough. This case, at its core, is about what serves Lucy Henderson's best interests, not adult rights, not biological connections, but a child's well-being." She turned to the Hendersons. "While I recognize your biological connection to Lucy, your timing and motivations raise significant concerns. The evidence suggests your interest may be influenced by Mr. Matthews' financial status rather than Lucy's welfare." Next, she addressed Richard. "Mr. Matthews, your commitment to Lucy is evident. You've provided stability, emotional support, and maintained her connection with Ms. Porter during her illness. Most importantly, you've prioritized Lucy's needs above your own convenience." Finally, she acknowledged Janet. "Ms. Porter, your selflessness in supporting this arrangement, despite your personal challenges, speaks volumes about your character and your love for your niece." Judge Winters straightened her papers. "It is the finding of this court that Lucy Henderson's best interests are served by permanent placement with Richard Matthews, with the adoption to proceed as planned. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson will be granted limited visitation rights, supervised initially, with potential for expansion based on relationship development." Outside the courthouse, snow began to fall, the first of the season. Richard helped Janet into the waiting car, then lifted Ethan into his seat. Lucy climbed in last, sitting between them. "Is it really over?" she asked, her small face uncertain. "They can't take me away?" Richard squeezed her hand. "It's really over, sweetheart." You're stuck with us now. Forever, Lucy pressed. Forever, Ethan confirmed, leaning against her shoulder. Janet smiled weakly from her seat. Family doesn't end, Lucy. It just grows in different ways. That evening, as snow continued to fall, Richard stood in the doorway of the family room. Ethan and Lucy were sprawled on the floor, building an elaborate Lego structure. Janet rested on the couch, watching them with tired but content eyes. Even Jessica had stayed, sitting nearby with a book, occasionally offering building suggestions. It wasn't the family Richard had imagined when he'd built his empire, when he'd married Jessica, when Ethan was born, or even when the accident had shattered their lives. It was messier, more complicated, touched by loss and impermanence. But watching Lucy laugh as she helped Ethan position a difficult piece, Richard knew it was exactly the family they all needed. "Dad!" Lucy called, noticing him in the doorway. "Come see what we built." And in, as Richard joined them on the floor, awkwardly folding his tall frame beside Ethan's wheelchair, he marveled at how it had all begun. A playground, a lonely boy, a brave girl who'd simply said, "Wanna play?" Sometimes, he realized, the smallest invitations open the largest doors to the heart.